All right, so this is Lou Reed's second studio album, Transformer. It comes in at number 33 on Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, number 6 in 1972, number 128 of all time, and in Rolling Stone's pretty close with Best Ever Albums. Rolling Stone says it's number 109 of all time. The album was recorded in August of 1972 and released on November 8th, 1972. And it's considered a fairly influential album, particularly in the glam rock genre, and it includes Lou Reed's most successful solo single, Walk on the Wild Side. You might have heard of that before. It was produced by David Bowie and Mick Ronson. And we covered Lou Reed a bunch of times. Josh gave us a lot of info on the Velvet Underground, which was his band that he was in. But I'll go over a little bit more about Lou Reed and his upbringing. He was born on March 2nd, 1942. It's
good birthday.
It's a good birthday. Very special for the CTS family here. And he was born in Brooklyn, and he grew up in Freeport, Long Island. His family was Jewish, and actually their original last name is Rabinowitz, but that was changed by his father to Reed. As a child, Lou Reed did suffer from panic attacks. He was socially awkward. And according to his sister, he possessed a fragile temperament. I don't think that any of those things are terribly surprising to any of us here.
No.
He would be very focused, though, even though he kind of had some attention issues. He would be the things that interested in him, particularly rock and roll, he did get very focused on those things and got very much into music. I read that he learned how to play the guitar from the radio. I don't know how that worked. I didn't get any more information on that, but somehow you're able to learn how to play the guitar through the radio. He played in several bands in high school and began taking drugs at the age of 16. Again, no surprise there. His first group was a three-piece doo-wop group called the Jades, and he played the guitar and sang backup. The band played a talent show at a local junior high school and received such a positive response that somehow they were offered an opportunity to record a few songs in the studio, along with saxophonist and I don't know if it's a CTS legend yet, but person that we've mentioned several times, King Curtis on the saxophone, played on the songs So Blue and Leave Her For Me, a couple of those songs with Lou Reed's earliest band. Didn't really materialize to much, though. Lou Reed did go on to Syracuse University, where Josh mentioned that before. He was brought home one day after suffering a mental breakdown, and he remained depressed, anxious, and non-responsive for a period of time. And to combat this, his parents agreed to electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. And Reed would later describe this experience as being very traumatic, and it led to some memory loss that he experienced. He also felt that this was a way to treat his feelings of homosexuality. Lou Reed is always, reading about his sexuality, there's lots of, pretty much the consensus is that he was bisexual, but he never really came out and talked about it specifically. He might have written about it in some music. He dated transsexuals and things like that. But yeah, he felt that this was a way to kind of suppress his homosexuality. Although his sister would later deny this and said, no, they were just doing this because of his anxiety and panic attacks.
Jeez, traumatic.
Yep. So after treatment,
Townes Van Zandt, right, had a similar story.
Oh, you're right. He did. I don't know about it because of being gay, but he definitely,
No, not because of being gay. He was married like 7 times, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So after this treatment, Reed goes back to Syracuse. He studies journalism, film, creative writing, and he also became a platoon leader in the ROTC program, which I found interesting. He didn't really like this, and in order to get
how does that happen? You know what I mean? Like, how does
I don't know.
How does anybody say, what would be a really good fit for you, Lou? Like, ROTC would be a really good, strong,
Well, Lou didn't really care for ROTC very much, and in an attempt to get out, in a successful attempt to get kicked out of ROTC, he held an empty gun to a superior's head.
Wow.
All he would have had to do is say, I like men in that era.
Yeah.
And then it's
Extreme.
Despite all of this, he did graduate cum laude from Syracuse with a BA in English in 1964. He then moved to New York City and began working as a songwriter for Pickwick Records, and this is around the time that he met John Cale, that Josh talked about and started and formed what would become the Velvet Underground. So if you're interested in some of those Velvet Underground episodes, go back to season 1, either episodes 26, 29, or 33, where we covered White Light, White Heat, the Velvet Underground, and the Velvet Underground and Nico, and season 2, episode 3, when we covered Loaded. So, fast forwarding, after the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed moves in with his parents and started and worked as a typist at his father's accounting firm, earning $40 a week.
A continuing string of jobs that just do not seem to line up at all with what Lou Reed would be strong at. So,
well, it also speaks to like how little success he saw with the Velvet Underground.
Really.
Right? He's going to work for $40 a week. $40 a week. Fun fact, equates to $267 in 2020. So still not a whole lot. Yeah.
Hey, Lou, what were you doing last night? Well, I was recording some songs about sending myself in a box to someone and repressed homosexual feelings. But I'm here to balance some ledgers today, guys. Yep. So yeah,
pretty much.
My band eventually will be super influential, but not for another 15 years.
He did, in 1971, he did sign a record deal with RCA Records, and he began working on his first solo album in London. Joining in for as session musicians included Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe from Yes, another combination I never would have saw coming.
We got to start making a map of how everyone's connected.
I know. It didn't sell well. Surprise, surprise. It included a lot of versions of unreleased Velvet Underground songs. It was also overlooked by critics. So for his second album, Reed brings in David Bowie and Mick Ronson to produce and perform on the record, which is the one we're covering tonight,
Good
Transformer.
Choice.
Yes. And again, this included a couple of songs from the Velvet Underground days that never made it to an album. So the musicians include Lou Reed on vocals and rhythm guitar, Mick Ronson on lead guitar, piano, recorder, and he was the arranger of the strings. David Bowie on backing vocals, keyboards, acoustic guitar, and a couple of other musicians. Herbie Flowers played the bass. John Halsley played the drums. And also Klaus Voormann. Do you guys remember Klaus Voormann?
From the Beatles.
From the Beatles days, that's right. Yeah. The guy that played with Paul and George and John. Actually, probably not Paul, actually, because he replaced Paul, basically, but he played on some bass here as well. A couple other quick things here. Walk on the Wild Side was the song that his most popular song, was written for what was supposed to be a film adaptation of a book of the same name, but it never got made. But Lou Reed still finished with the song. It was an unlikely hit that talks of transgender issues, sex acts, and drugs. And it was played on the radio, and the BBC censors obviously missed a lot of the the word was they didn't understand what giving head meant. So people were pretty floored that made it past the censors. So I got a few things to tie up the end of Lou Reed and his life and his career. But let's talk about our reactions to this record. We will start. I think we got to go with John. What do you think of Transformer, John?
Yeah, man, I love this album, and I think if we hadn't started, awesome.
Josh, I didn't say you yet. Slow your roll.
I just had to jump in.
If we hadn't started with White Light, White Heat from the Velvet Underground, I'd realize how much I like the Velvet Underground, because like every time we keep doing something, I think it was just the one miss shot for me is White Light, White Heat, because after that, I mean, I'm digging what they're putting, and it seems to me that the more Lou Reed was involved with the Velvet Underground, the more I like them, because I like the second self-titled album and Loaded quite a bit, and he has an unusual ability to write hooks but not sound at all like he's building to a hook, and he gets to them non-traditionally, and they're not verse chorus type hooks either. But he kind of meanders around sometimes, and then sometimes gets there really quick, right? And uses repetition in his lyrics. His songcraft is fascinating because he goes between more oblique stuff at times, and you're not quite sure what he's getting at, but you could put pieces together, to being like hyper literal at certain times, and sometimes in the same song. And that is a really fascinating lyrical device. The background music, once again, I think I mentioned this on especially the later Velvet albums, but the first one has it as well, sort of it's really cool to listen to it on headphones because there's little craft built in that, you can hear that polished Bowie and Ronson production that sounds like a Bowie album or sounds like a T-Rex album or the Iggy Pop and Stooges stuff that we've done, right? So there's hallmarks that it's one of these Bowie productions, and I know Bowie loves Lou Reed. In fact, part of what they said his persona was, right, was part Lou Reed and part Iggy Pop, right? I think we even talked about that in an episode. But there's elements of that Bowie and Ronson production, but then there's also hallmarks that you can immediately recognize if you're a Velvet Underground fan of what Lou Reed sounded like and how he wrote songs for the Velvets. So I really was digging this album. Even the stuff that's bizarre, like New York Telephone Conversation, right, it fits in the context of the theme of this album. Like, now, Josh, was there a theme to this album? Because, like, a lot of stuff that Lou Reed writes seems to me that it's about the darker side of, like, New York City life. I know he writes about drugs a lot too, but it's not I think his drug songs are more oblique kind of, whereas his sex songs are more overt, I'd say. And when we talk sex songs, by the way, it's funny that we're doing Stevie Wonder next, right? Who writes these like very romantic, like Lou Reed does not write about sex as like a beautiful thing, right? It's more of like almost like a curiosity and a boundary pushing way of looking at sex. Transgressive would be another word I would say. But even the stuff that's a little bit odd, like New York Telephone Conversation, works. But can I just also throw in, I mean, people are going to know Walk on the Wild Side and Perfect Day, right? Because it's almost become like a meme at this point. But Vicious, I recognize because I've heard that before, but it's certainly not a like super mainstream song. But I love that song. I also love Satellite of Love, which also operates in that thing where if you're a music fan, you might know it like Vicious, but if you may not know it if you're not as familiar with Lou Reed. And I liked Goodnight Ladies as well. That lyrically in particular is I like quite a bit, but I really did like this. In fact, I would go so far, guys, as to say this is a top 10 album of the 70s for me so far. That's how much I like this album. So, yep, big thumbs up for me. Deep Purple is high on that list too, by the way, in case you're wondering. So, 2 albums that are going to be high on my 70s list today. So, strong thumbs up, Josh.
Well, I am right lockstepping with you. This is a strong recommend for me, and I think it is on my top 10 of the 70s so far. Talk about an album that is incredibly influential. It feels like every artist I can think of sounds something like this, like the Pixies or obviously the Velvet Underground, but it seems also more upbeat than the Velvet Underground. And the songcraft, like John said, is just, he writes incredibly catchy songs. I mean, almost all of these songs on here are very listenable and in sort of a weird, unconventional way. I guess in the way that the Velvet Underground also was. I think this is an essential listen for people because they would kind of be sucked in by the unusualness and the kind of off-kilter nature of this album, but then he brings in like hooks that are so catchy, and I think that's a testament to why a lot of these songs have been used in pop culture and covered or just been in the ether with throughout the years. I think Bowie and Ronson probably have something to do with that as well. I really like kind of the things that, like in Satellite of Love, where he has the backing singers sing bum bum bum, and like the catchy piano on Hanging Round, and there's tuba and makeup, and so he peppers all of these, or Bowie and Ronson pepper all of these things into the album to make it sound unlike anything else, with the exception of the Velvet Underground. And I'm not sure if I like this more than the Velvet Underground albums, but it's right up there neck and neck with them. Can
I share an observation, Josh, based on what you said? He's got a little bit of a shared lineage with a little bit of what Phil Spector was doing, doesn't he? Even though he's also, like, in terms of the complexity and how he's doing things and that homage to, like, classic rock and roll music, like, he definitely, you can tell, is slightly influenced by that. But he doesn't in any way do it in the easy, like there's no shortcuts for him. You know, he manages to stay poppy, but without taking any of the shortcuts that would make something commercially successful, which is such an odd, there's not many acts that can write catchy songs like he does, but also not have really any commercial, appeal.
Right. Yeah, he's not very like approachable type of figure. He's always been kind of irascible, right, in interviews, and especially as he's aged. Wait, is he dead now, Matt? I can't remember.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he died in 2013.
Okay, and he's not like a recognizable name in the way I would say David Bowie is or something like that. But so on the one hand, you kind of had this abrasive personality, or at least kind of off, standoffish type of personality. And obviously, with everything that Matt said in his bio, like he's got some emotional trauma and things that he worked through. But then when you look at the songs that he writes, it's just like kind of crazy that he writes these really catchy songs. I guess I'm interested in kind of the dichotomy of that on the one hand, he seems to not hate humanity, but seems like he wouldn't write these types of songs, I guess. And his voice isn't really, we've said this before, it's not like he has a voice like Stevie Wonder that can really sing or something like that. He's kind of got a rough voice as well, but paired with these songs, it just works in a way that I really respond to. Perfect Day I recognized from Train Spotting. That's definitely a way. And then some of these other songs like Wagon Wheel, which I thought was another strong song, and Hanging Round, which I really liked. They've come up as well. I think Satellite of Love I've heard from movies or TV as well. But yeah, I think everyone should listen to this album. I think it's really strong in a surprising way, especially if you hadn't heard it before. I think it's got a lot of depth and value to it.
So to answer your question, John, there's some theme in here. It's a lot of this is very much inspired by Andy Warhol and the New York scene, what he was doing at his warehouse. Vicious was a song that Warhol basically went up to Lou Reed and said, "Hey, I think you should write a song called Vicious." And he's like, "What do you mean vicious?" Like you hit me with a flower. And Lou Reed's like, "Okay." So he wrote Vicious because he just had that conversation with Andy Warhol.
Like, I think of Lou Reed and like the Velvets, even though it's the late 60s and the early 70s, as almost like, what New York was in the 70s, right? Where it was this like dangerous place. And I know it continued to the 80s, but it became like dangerous in the 80s, right? Where in the 70s it was dangerous, but it was also like if you were a creative person who didn't fit anywhere else, like New York was the most vibrant. I mean, there were all these people around, and so like when I heard this album, I was like, this is like scoring New York in the early to mid set. And we're gonna do the New York Dolls too in a little bit, and that's another album that. And I think maybe it's because I grew up outside of New York, and I kind of came of age in New York, right, at the era when New York was being cleaned up. And so you always heard like how New York used to have an energy and stuff. And, New York always has an energy, right? But like I almost felt like I missed the prime of New York, and like this sort of represents like what people talk of as like the prime,
like
right?
the romanticized version of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because no one romanticizes 80s New York, right? Because by then it was like all the gates of Pandora's box had come. But people absolutely romanticize, 70s and even very early 80s New York, as one of the last raw places on earth.
Yeah. Well, and that's where you get songs like New York Telephone Conversation, Walk on the Wild Side. I mean, these songs are about what he saw. Walk on the Wild Side, each verse is about a different person that he met or knew about. It's interesting. I watched, Josh, you were telling me about the documentary about Transformer that PBS did that you can see it on Amazon Prime. And they interviewed some of those people, and they were like, I met Lou Reed for 5 minutes once, like, and years later somebody's like, hey, he wrote about you in this song, Walk on the Wild Side. So, and Andy's Chest is about the attempted assassination of Andy Warhol. So a lot of this is very much New York. Lou Reed is very, very much is considered a New York artist. He is New York in a lot of ways. That's just, that's the scene. And a lot of these songs were about, either Andy Warhol or his association with him or the people that he was with at that time. and all that stuff. So I really like this album as well. I don't know if God, it's really hard for me to say what's in my top 10. I just at this point, this is going to be a lot harder than the 60s for me. But it's a great album. This is so varied. Right, there's so much stuff going on here. He's all over the place, and I'm like looking at this, going, Lou Reed is like the godfather of indie rock. You know, there's just, and this album is 1972, and it doesn't sound anything like 1972. You know what I mean? Like this is like
like nothing the Velvets do. Sounds like
this is just like a very modern sounding album in a time when you didn't have many modern sounding albums. And one of the other things that you guys say some interesting things about his gift for melody, it's certainly there. And when I heard Perfect Day, I forgot about that song. I didn't know that it was a Lou Reed song. That is such a that chorus, that song might be one of the most beautiful songs that I've heard in this entire run of this podcast. It is such a great song. And he's got this like Leonard Cohen type style about him.
That's a good comparison.
That that can write like this amazingly beautiful song and sing it in a non-traditional way. Like his voice is kind of wavering, like on purpose there. You know what I mean? But it's all part of his style. And it's Leonard Cohen does a similar thing with a lot of his songs as well.
Yeah, but I find Lou Reed to be so much more compelling than Leonard Cohen.
I do. Well, and he's certainly much more interesting. He's much more varied. Leonard Cohen's kind of like a one-tone kind of thing, but he can write some beautiful melodies. It's just I was thinking about that comparison, but I agree. I think Lou Reed is a much more interesting artist. Goodnight Ladies is a very interesting song. It's like this Dixieland kind of horn section going on, you know, that's just like kind of comes out of nowhere. You know, New York Telephone Conversations, like the show tune, offbeat piano part. It's only a minute and a half, right? It just kind of goes in and out. And then he's certainly got glam stuff on here. You know, a song like I'm So Free, or was it Hanging Around? You know, these more upbeat kind of like hand claps, very much in the light of a T-Rex or a Bowie kind of a thing. And then he's got Walk on the Wild Side, which is one of the most iconic probably bass riffs that you're ever going to hear, which is actually two bass parts. The bass player played an upright double bass, and then he played for the higher part. He played an electric bass. And so that was kind of an interesting part of that documentary. But yeah, just very good, very cool. Just a very cool sounding guy. And when you see him interviewed, he's very appreciative of what David Bowie and Mick Ronson did on this. You know, particularly with Ronson's arrangements of the strings on a song like Perfect Day. He was very he was very pleased with Bowie's singing on the background at the end of Satellite of Love, which is kind of like this repetitive kind of chorus thing that they go into, but it builds. It's got the horns, and you got David Bowie on the high part of hitting that high note at the end, which Lou Reed really liked. So I love the collaboration here with Ronson and Bowie, and it's a very interesting album. This one goes by fast, pretty much too. I would say it's 36 minutes.
Yeah.
So again, not long doesn't overstay its welcome, but damn, Lou Reed is cool. Like, you know what I mean? And he's very, very unimpressed with himself. When he was interviewed about this album, he just said, "It's just an album." You know, it's like that's all it is. It's an album. It's fine. It's good. Relax.
Can I add something too? Because it's interesting because Bowie gets the rap, and rightfully so, of being like, you know, transcendent and, you know, kind of being able to do it. But in many ways, he just rode trends exceptionally well. He spotted them, but he was in his moment, right? He was he was glam, right? And then later he'd, you know, krautrock, and he'd kind of run with that, and you know, he's just do it. And even the Blue-Eyed Soul stuff he does in like his middle period is kind of backwards looking. To me, the interesting thing is his two people are Lou Reed and Iggy Pop, because to me they seem like space aliens thrown into like the late 60s and early 70s, basically inventing music for the next like 20 years while nothing around them sounds like them. You know what I mean? Like Lou Reed and Iggy Pop to me exist in a plane, and you know, throw the Stooges and Velvet Underground, right? Those are the two bands that there is nothing that sounds like these people, and everything after them sounds like them, but they have like no audience, right, outside of only the most avant-garde. Even the cool people don't necessarily catch on to them, right? Like these are people like still holding jobs and stuff, and it's just fascinating because like it almost is they were thrown onto earth to show us what was going to be coming in music, and I'm trying to think if there were other periods of time in like the 80s and 90s, right, where you saw like people that operated almost like space aliens, like they were doing something that people weren't doing and then didn't do for like 10 years later, but it became so obvious as to what they were doing was what the next thing. But I mean, it's too, I don't know if there are many because, and maybe as we go through the, late 70s, 80s and 90s, it'll become as clear, but do you guys see it like I do? Like you hear the Velvets and the Stooges were ahead of their time and stuff, but like I cannot stress enough how much nothing sounds like these guys when we're listening to it. They come out of nowhere with really the only thing that sounds like them is themselves to some degree.
Would you put Sabbath in there?
I mean, yeah, Sabbath and that early Zeppelin album, I think we all commented on the fact that they were there, but you could even see some roots of where they came from,
there
right?
Some blues. There's definitely blues influence, and you can hear that in some of their early stuff.
And I mean, there's a little like 50s doo-wop-y type stuff with what Lou Reed does, like buried underneath a little bit, and a little bit of the Spectre-y thing. And, in Iggy Pop's case, he says he listened to the Beatles and stuff like that. But just their personas, too. They were just these guys were so far ahead of their time. And I think you almost have to be as disconnected from – you have to be cool but also disconnected at all from trying to be cool, right, in the way – and probably you have to take a shit ton of drugs, right? But, like, that's kind of, like, what these guys were. And I just want to throw that in there because I can't stress enough, like, how much they seem like, I said space aliens, but which is funny because, Bowie loves them. He loves space. So maybe he just saw them as space aliens too. So
Bowie's in space.
I think for me, the more I hear this album, it's kind of my definition of what a cool album or what a like classic pop album, what I want something like that to sound like is. And then retroactively, if somebody had like shown me this album, or, had me listen to this album when I was a teenager, I probably would have just kind of transformed what I was into as far as music or pop culture was. And
would you have turned into Morrissey? A guy who notoriously loves like everything Velvet Underground. So
I'm just thinking in terms of like how much I like it and respond to it now and what I would have liked it as an earlier age. And because these are the songs that you hear or I heard in the background and not necessarily on the radio or like from a movie like Trainspotting and not knowing who it was or what it was, just knowing that it's like a really good catchy song and like knowing that it's Lou Reed now and like that it's just kind of iconoclastic, just classic in terms of rock music and where it goes. It's just kind of transcendent for me in that way.
And I thought of something, Matt. Your brother said he's always on the search for the perfect like 3 to 4 minute pop song, right?
Yeah.
And I had a lot of things that coming into the 60s and 70s I would have held up as, like Brown Eyed Girl or Here Comes the Sun, right? Like songs I could have done stuff. The more time that comes on, the more I realize that I think Sunday Morning by the Velvet Underground is like the perfect pop song of the
really?
60s. I keep coming back to that as like when I listen to it, I'm like, it's pretty much a perfect freaking pop song. You know what I mean? And like that encapsulates where I've come around on the Velvets, right?
Yeah,
in terms
you've
of
really evolved in real time on the show.
Well, let's be honest. I mean, the White Light, White Heat album is just vastly different than all the
well,
other
and
stuff,
I was very under educated on the like I knew they were influential and I knew bits and pieces and I knew Lou Reed's solo career, little stuff. I knew the narrative, but I did not have the level of appreciation for their music and just they are the ultimate grower band. They really, if you like music, they become the ultimate grower band because of the tendrils that go out to everything else, right? And so it just hit me this week where I was like, this is just a different way of doing pop music, right? That just is every bit as viable. But like I had to like basically understand, and I started thinking about it, and I'm like, I just think of those last couple Velvet segments we did, right? Where there was like a song on each of them that stayed in my head for like a month after we did it, right? And then I realized, oh shit, I think that Sunday Morning and Pale Blue Eyes might actually be the best pop songs I listened to in the 60s, and I can't believe I'm saying that. So, yeah.
Sunday morning.
You kind of like it. Yeah, it's good, man. And it creeps up on you. You know what I mean? Like
It really did.
It's not an in your face kind of like, with those songs that you hear on the radio that have like that really catchy chorus that just grabs you right away and gets people dancing and singing along. It's kind of like it's a subtle type of catchy. It's a very intelligent and very unique way of doing music, and he does it so well.
Like, is there even a modern equivalent of this? Nothing that they play on the radio is like this.
I mean, there's tons of stuff that was highly influenced by this.
Yeah,
and,
indie rock became a thing, right? So and even some indie rock acts broke out a little bit and did get a little bit more mainstream. But
you'd have to be like ahead of your time, right? We wouldn't be looking.
So
like, I think of somebody like Beck, right? Or like Bjork, and the people that like were operating where they were known, right? Like within the artistic world, but really a lot of people weren't. Like, I'm trying to, like, that's the type, I mean, they don't sound
Radiohead.
like him, but yeah, but to some degree though, Radiohead was just taking stuff that you could do and reinventing it kind of, but I'm saying you have to be operating outside of like what anybody else is. It's kind of like what Krautrock was trying to do.
Yeah, well, they're all doing that though. I mean, like everybody's taking elements from something, but Radiohead did Kid A. That came out of nowhere. Nobody was doing an album like that,
Yeah,
so,
I guess I don't think of them as being as good as Radiohead is. I don't think of them as being like vanguards, right? They just do artistic stuff. I don't think of them as like, they always seemed of their place, and of their time. Like, I think it's like the persona that you have to get to, where a guy's like drifting through the era, or a person is drifting through the era. I don't know if that makes sense, Matt. I think Josh knows exactly what I'm talking about, and I don't, you know what I mean? It's hard to explain.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to sit here and go like, oh, well, this artist was totally doing. I guess when you say like somebody like Beck or Bjork, yeah, they did things that were totally different. But I don't know. It's hard for me to come up with a classic list of all of that. But I think that Lou Reed and what he did with the Velvet Underground, a lot of that stuff starts here, with that type of at least with indie rock. I keep going back to that, but that's what really this is, and one of the reasons I say that is because it's so varied, and he's just doing so many different things that you hear in a lot of indie rock today. But yeah, it's great. It's very interesting. I didn't really know a whole lot of this or Velvet Underground stuff either going into this, and I think I agree. I think the more you let it sit with you, the better it gets, and it's interesting because it's He's not doing a ton of stuff. It's you talk about Beck or Bjork. They seem more adventurous. I don't know. White Light, White Heat was a little bit more full and a little bit more, I guess you could say, sonically adventurous. But a lot of this is very muted. It's very subtle. Right. It's very basic. But it's still unique and it's still interesting and it's still really good.
So I found the thing that said the 10 artists who were most ahead of their time, guys. Because I was curious right here.
Okay.
By album, here's the 10 that they said. So Sister Rosetta, who invented the rock and roll guitar, so way back in the day. They said the Beatles for doing the analog studio. MF Doom, who's now doing hip hop. They have said,
well, he just died too.
He just died, right? Recently. So they said he would fall into
Josh.
that. They had Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground.
Yeah.
They had Bjork. They had Can.
Okay.
They had R. Stevie Moore. The Stooges,
yep.
Beck, The Clash, and Captain Beefheart. That was the 10 artists they said. And they said honorable mention to Miles Davis. So a lot of people that we've covered. And interesting that, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back, but I don't know what it is, man. There's just something I can hear in these type of people. You know what I mean? That just they're like space aliens in their time. And I'm going to be on the lookout for them in the future as well.
John, did you look at that list before? You said Beck and Bjork before. Is that what happened?
I didn't, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, because it just was fascinating to me, because I was like, okay, I'm on to something here, because the first thing I Googled, artists who were ahead of their musicians who were ahead of their time, it was a top 10 list, and you go.
I think I heard of all those people except the second to last person you said.
Stephen Moore or whatever.
Yeah, who's that? I never heard of that.
So I'll give you R. Stephen Moore, according to this, let me go back up to him. By the way, I'd argue with The Clash, and The Clash is my favorite band in the world, but I don't know if I think of them that way, right? You know, they reinvented stuff. So R. Stevie Moore has been called the godfather of DIY, of lo-fi, and home recording as we know it.
It's like Daniel Johnston, like that guy?
He began recording as a teenager in the late 60s and retired in 2020. But he is a perennially obscure songwriter who would release his own material and was, so that's
what was his name again? R. what?
R. Stephen Moore, or R. Stevie Moore, excuse me. R. Stevie Moore.
He is on Spotify.
Okay, so you can check him out if you want to hear him.
R. Stevie Moore. There you go.
What do you think the time lag has to be for artists to be discovered and be considered ahead of their time? Is it like
10 years? 10
years,
years, I think. Yeah. I think it's 10 years.
So who from 2011 is now considered?
That's a really good question. We have to think about it. You know what I mean?
Dua Lipa.
No, we'd have to think about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I'm sure we could look at it and find people that I mean, and we might not totally. We'll just be processing it, you know, because we'll be seeing it in the output of the music right now.
In some ways, I'm thinking like somebody like Kanye was kind of like that too for a while until he went like full crazy. But yeah, I felt like that listening to him somewhat.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's something we could look into. So maybe that can be a homework assignment for us. Mm-hmm. All right. Can I take the spot for Stevie here?
Well, I had a couple more things here.
Oh, go for it.
Yep. So just to cut up, because this is the last time we're covering Lou Reed, and so he does release several out. He's got like 20 plus albums out there, by the way.
Geez.
So if you want, there's plenty more Lou Reed where that came from, and of course, a lot of them sound different from each other, so it's not all the same. But he did reunite with the Velvet Underground briefly, as Josh might have mentioned before, but that didn't really last too long, as he and John Cale, couldn't really get along. So they did a couple of tours in the early 90s, but that was about it. A couple of fun facts. Lou Reed made a cameo appearance in the unreleased 1995 Penn and Teller video game, which he appears, if you chose the impossible difficulty rating, he appears as the unbeatable boss who murders the player with his laser beam eyes.
Wow.
And that's actually, you can read more about that on Wikipedia, because that was the Penn and Teller video game from the 95. He worked with several artists, including Metallica, The Killers, and Gorillaz. And in 2002, they named an asteroid. There was an asteroid that was discovered that they named after Lou Reed. It's asteroid number 270553, Lou Reed. So he's got an asteroid named after him,
Nice.
And as well as a spider.
Satellite of love.
Satellite of love, asteroid of love. He also has a species of spiders named after him. This spider was discovered in 2012. It was a type of velvet spider, which I didn't know was a type of spider. And this particular velvet spider lives underground, so they named it Luredia as the
Like
velvet underground spider.
Nice.
You got it.
Awesome.
So Lou Reed, he did suffer from hepatitis and diabetes for many years. He eventually developed liver cancer. He did undergo a liver transplant in May of 2013, but he did eventually pass away on October 27th, 2013, at the age of 71. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of the Velvet Underground in 1996 and as a solo artist in 2014. So rest in peace, Lou Reed. You were one of the greats.
Absolutely. And can I throw Trent Reznor out as someone for that list, by the way?
Yeah,
People
that's
that
a
are
good
10
one.
that
That's a
exist
good one.
outside of their thing. I was just thinking of that. I did not Google that, by the way. I was
He's
just thinking
kind
in
of
my brain.
transformed too into this
Movie
score,
yeah.
guy.
Yep. So I would throw him in as another person who sort of exists as a zombie ghost, person ahead of their time. So